Is this some kind of joke? The guard's voice cut through the dry afternoon air, sharp and unrestrained, echoing off the concrete barriers that framed the entrance to Fort Ridgeline as a line of black SUVs idled just beyond the gate, their engines humming low like restrained thunder, and in front of that checkpoint, unmoving and unbothered, stood an old man who didn't belong in the guard's version of the world. His jacket was faded, the kind of olive drab that hadn't been issued in decades, his boots worn soft at the edges, and his posture, straight, still, unyielding, carried a quiet weight that didn't match the dismissive glance he was being given. Private Collins stepped forward, his polished boots crunching against gravel, his uniform crisp, his badge catching the sun just enough to remind everyone watching exactly where authority was supposed to sit, and right now, in his mind, it wasn't with the man in front of him. "This is a restricted military installation," Collins said, slower this time, louder. Making sure the small cluster of waiting personnel nearby could hear him clearly, "You need proper clearance, or you need to turn around," but the old man didn't move, didn't blink, didn't offer the explanation Collins expected, and that silence, calm, steady, immovable, began to irritate him in a way he couldn't quite explain. There was something in the way the man stood, like he had stood through worse and didn't feel the need to prove it to anyone anymore. A second guard shifted beside Collins. Arms crossed, watching with mild amusement as if this were nothing more than a routine inconvenience, just another lost civilian who wandered too close to a place they didn't understand, but the old man's eyes, pale and steady, weren't on them at all. They were fixed somewhere past the gate, beyond the saluting posts and flag lines, as if the base itself was just a memory he was measuring against something older. Collins exhaled sharply, stepping closer now, invading space, trying to force a reaction. "Sir, I'm not going to repeat myself again," he said, his tone tightening. "You're holding up a secured convoy," and for the first time, the old man shifted, not back, not away, but just enough to reach into the inside pocket of his jacket, slow, deliberate, every movement controlled, not the motion of someone intimidated, but of someone who had learned long ago that speed was unnecessary when you already understood how things would unfold. He didn't pull out an ID, didn't offer a badge or a card, just a small folded piece of paper, worn thin along the creases, and Collins frowned immediately, unimpressed, already dismissing it before even seeing what was written. "What is that supposed to be?" he muttered, taking it without care, glancing down for barely a second before letting out a short, humorless laugh. "You expect this to mean something," he said. Shaking his head, holding it up loosely between two fingers like it weighed nothing. "Arthur Hale," he read aloud, the name rolling off his tongue with casual disregard. "That's it? No rank, no clearance code, no unit." He looked back up, smirking now, confident in his judgment. "I don't know who you think you are, sir, but names don't get you through this gate." And behind him, one of the waiting drivers shifted in his seat, glancing toward the exchange with quiet curiosity, while a junior officer standing near the convoy straightened slightly, something subtle catching his attention, not the words, not the posture of the guard, but the stillness of the man being questioned, the way he didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't react the way most people did when they were being dismissed. Collins handed the paper back with a dismissive flick, already turning his shoulder as if the situation was resolved. "Turn around and head back to the public entrance," he said, firm now, final. "This conversation is over." But the old man didn't take the paper right away, his gaze finally lowering, not to the guard, but to the name written there, as if it carried more weight than the entire checkpoint in front of him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, carrying just enough to reach Collins without effort. "Just tell Colonel Hayes Arthur Hale is here." And something in the air shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but enough that the junior officer by the convoy paused completely, his expression tightening, as if a detail he couldn't place had just landed exactly where it didn't belong. Private Collins let out a quiet scoff, the kind that came from someone who believed the situation was already beneath him, but the junior officer near the convoy did not move, his attention now fixed entirely on the old man as if something had just shifted into place that he could not ignore. Captain Daniel Brooks had been halfway through reviewing a transport manifest on his tablet when the name reached him, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough to cut through the routine noise of the checkpoint, and for a moment he did not react outwardly, his posture remaining composed, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he replayed the words in his mind. "Arthur Hale." The syllables settling into something that felt older than the present moment, something tied to briefings, to passing mentions in conversations that were never fully explained, and he found himself stepping forward without realizing it, closing the distance between himself and the gate as Collins turned back toward his post with a dismissive shake of his head. "We are done here," Collins muttered, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve, already shifting his attention back to the waiting convoy as if the man behind him had ceased to exist, but Brooks spoke. Before the moment could fully pass, his voice calm, controlled, carrying just enough authority to interrupt without escalating. "Private, hold for a second," and Collins paused, just enough to glance over his shoulder with mild irritation, not expecting anything of consequence, but Brooks was no longer looking at him, his focus locked entirely on the old man, studying him in a way that went beyond surface details, noting the stillness, the absence of defensiveness, the quiet certainty that did not fit the situation. Brooks stepped closer now, his boots measured against the gravel, stopping a few feet away, careful not to intrude. "Sir," he said, respectful but cautious, "did you say you are here to see Colonel Hayes?" And the old man gave a slight nod, nothing exaggerated, nothing performed, just confirmation, and Brooks felt that same tightening in his chest, the kind that came when a detail refused to align with expectation. Collins exhaled sharply, clearly unimpressed. "Captain. With all due respect, we cannot just let people walk in because they name-drop a colonel," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the old man. "We have protocols for a reason." But Brooks did not respond immediately, his gaze still on Arthur Hale as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had just revealed its first edge, and then he spoke again, quieter this time, more deliberate. "Sir, do you have any identification on you?" And there was no accusation in the question, only procedure, but also something else beneath it, something closer to caution than authority. Arthur reached into his jacket once more, slower than before, pulling out a worn leather wallet, the edges softened by time, and handed it over without hesitation, and Brooks took it carefully, flipping it open with practiced ease, his eyes scanning the contents, not for credentials alone, but for confirmation, for something that would either resolve the tension or deepen it, and what he saw did not immediately answer the question, but it did not dismiss it either. The identification was valid, simple, unremarkable on the surface, but the name was there again, Arthur Hale, printed clearly, consistently, and Brooks felt a subtle shift in the air around him, as if the name itself carried weight that had not yet been fully understood. Behind him, the convoy driver leaned slightly out of his window, watching more openly now, while a second officer further down the line straightened, sensing the change in tone even without hearing the words. Collins crossed his arms, impatience returning. "Captain, we are holding up a secured movement," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "If he does not have clearance, we need to move him along." But Brooks closed the wallet slowly, his mind already moving past the immediate exchange, connecting fragments, recalling a briefing from months ago, a passing reference to a name that had been spoken with a kind of quiet respect that did not invite questions, and he looked back at Arthur Hale, really looked this time, at the posture, the composure, the silence that did not feel like uncertainty but like restraint, and he made a decision that was small in action but heavy in implication. "Private," Brooks said, his tone shifting just enough to carry weight, "maintain position," and before Collins could respond, Brooks stepped aside, pulling his phone from his pocket, turning slightly away from the group, his voice low as he placed the call, each word measured, precise. "Command, this is Captain Brooks at Gate 3, he said, pausing just long enough for the line to connect. "I need verification on a visitor requesting Colonel Hayes." His eyes flicked briefly back toward the old man, steady, unmoving. "Name is Arthur Hale." The line stayed quiet for half a second longer than it should have, and in that silence Captain Brooks felt something tighten, not urgency, but recognition waiting to surface. Then a voice came through, clipped and professional. "Command here, go ahead," and Brooks kept his tone steady, careful not to overstate what he did not yet understand. "I need identity verification on a civilian at Gate 3 requesting direct contact with Colonel Richard Hayes." He paused just briefly, letting the name settle before continuing. "Name is Arthur Hale," and there was a shift. Subtle but unmistakable, not in volume, not in words, but in the space between them, the kind of pause that did not belong to routine procedure. Collins noticed it too, even if he could not define it, his posture stiffening slightly as he watched Brooks from the corner of his eye, irritation beginning to give way to something less certain, while the second guard stopped smirking altogether, his gaze drifting back toward the old man as if reassessing what he thought he understood. On the other end of the line, the voice returned, slower now, "Say that name again," and Brooks repeated it without hesitation, each syllable clear, deliberate, "Arthur Hale," and this time the silence stretched longer, not empty, but filled with movement that could not be seen, like a door opening somewhere far above their level, a faint sound of papers shifting, a muted exchange in the background, then the voice came back, lower, more controlled, "Stand by." And the line did not disconnect, it held, open. Waiting, and Brooks did not speak again, his eyes lifting slightly as if he could feel the chain of command moving, invisible but precise. Behind him, one of the convoy drivers straightened fully in his seat now, the idle engine forgotten, while another officer further down the line lowered his clipboard without realizing it, attention drawn to the stillness gathering at the gate. Collins cleared his throat, trying to reassert the structure he was used to. "Captain, we cannot just hold a secured convoy on a maybe," he said, but his voice lacked the earlier sharpness, the certainty chipped away by something he could not name, and Brooks did not turn, did not acknowledge the comment directly, his focus still anchored to the man standing quietly a few feet away, unchanged, unaffected, as if the entire exchange had already played out somewhere else and this was only the echo. Arthur Hale stood exactly as he had before, hands relaxed at his sides, shoulders level, eyes steady, not watching the guards, not watching the vehicles, but looking past it all, as if time itself had slowed around him and he had no need to follow it. Then the voice returned on the line, but it was not the same voice, not the same cadence. This one carried weight, authority compressed into restraint. "This is executive office," it said, and Brooks felt his spine straighten instinctively. "Confirm the individual is still present." Brooks answered immediately, "Yes sir, he is here." Another pause, shorter this time, sharper, "Do not let him leave," and the words landed with quiet force, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. "Maintain position. Colonel Hayes has been notified," and the line ended without further explanation. Brooks lowered the phone slowly, the weight of the instruction settling into the space around him, and for a moment no one spoke, not the guards, not the officers, not even the drivers who now watched openly, the entire checkpoint suspended in a silence that felt different from before, heavier, deliberate. Collins shifted his stance, his earlier confidence no longer sitting the same way on his shoulders. "Captain, what is going on?" he asked, quieter now, the edge gone, replaced by something closer to uncertainty, and Brooks finally turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Collins's gaze, his expression controlled but no longer neutral. "We wait," he said simply, and as those words settled, a distant engine sound began to rise from deeper within the base, not fast, not aggressive, but purposeful, drawing closer with a steady rhythm that did not belong to routine traffic, and for the first time since the encounter began, Collins looked back at Arthur Hale not with dismissal, but with the faint, growing realization that whatever was coming through that gate was not for him. The low rumble grew louder, no longer a distant suggestion but a clear presence cutting through the controlled stillness of the gate, and every head turned instinctively toward the inner road as a dark government sedan approached at a steady, deliberate pace, not fast enough to signal urgency, but not slow enough to be routine, its movement carrying a kind of quiet authority that did not need explanation. Captain Brooks straightened fully now, shoulders squared, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a focused awareness, while Private Collins shifted his weight unconsciously, his boots grinding slightly into the gravel as he tried to reassemble the confidence he had worn so easily just minutes ago. The vehicle rolled closer, its tires whispering against the pavement before coming to a precise stop just short of the checkpoint barrier, and for a brief moment, nothing happened, no doors opened, no commands were given, just a pause that stretched long enough to draw every eye toward it, as if the entire scene were holding its breath. Then the rear door opened, smooth and controlled, and Colonel Richard Hayes stepped out, his uniform immaculate, his posture firm, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere without a single word, and it was not just his rank that carried weight, it was the way he moved, direct, purposeful, his eyes already scanning ahead before his feet fully settled on the ground. Collins snapped to attention almost instinctively, his earlier tone gone completely, replaced by trained reflex. "Sir," he said sharply, but the word barely registered as Hayes walked past him without acknowledgement, his focus locked on one point alone. Captain Brooks stepped aside, giving space without being told, and for a fraction of a second, Hayes paused, just enough to take in the figure standing beyond the barrier, and something shifted in his expression, not confusion, not doubt, but recognition arriving all at once, heavy and undeniable. Arthur Hale had not moved, not since the vehicle had appeared, his stance unchanged, his gaze steady, as if he had been waiting not for confirmation, but for time to catch up. Hayes took one step forward, then another, slower now, each movement measured, his eyes narrowing slightly as if verifying something he already knew but needed to see with his own eyes, and the silence around them deepened, the guards no longer speaking, the convoy drivers leaning forward, even the wind seeming to pull back from the moment. Collins felt it fully now, the shift he had missed earlier, the invisible line that had moved without warning, placing him on the wrong side of something he did not understand, and for the first time, he did not look at the old man as an inconvenience, but as a question he could not answer. Hayes stopped just a few feet away from Arthur Hale, close enough to see every detail, the worn jacket, the quiet eyes, the stillness that had not changed, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with something older than rank, older than protocol, something that did not need to be explained to anyone watching. Then Hayes exhaled slowly, a breath that carried weight, and his voice, when it came, was lower than expected, controlled but unmistakably altered. "Sir." The word landed differently than any spoken at that gate before. Not a formality, not a courtesy, but a recognition that rewrote everything that had come before it, and behind him. Collins felt his posture falter just slightly, the realization settling in with quiet force, not through orders or reprimands, but through the absence of both. Hayes removed his cap in one smooth motion, not rushed, not exaggerated, just precise, and held it at his side as he stood before the man he had come to meet, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, heavy, absolute, spreading outward from the center of the moment until even the smallest movement felt out of place, and in that silence, the weight of a single name, Arthur Hale, finally revealed itself without a single explanation being spoken. For a long moment, Arthur Hale said nothing, and that silence held the same quiet weight it had carried from the very beginning, as if words were unnecessary in a place where recognition had already spoken louder than anything else could, and Colonel Hayes did not rush to fill it, his posture steady, his cap still held at his side, his gaze fixed not with authority, but with something closer to respect that had been waiting years to be given. The air around them remained still, the checkpoint frozen in a state that no one had been trained for, where protocol no longer dictated the next step, and even the faint hum of the convoy engine seemed to fade into the background. Private Collins stood rigid, but it was no longer the rigidity of confidence, it was the stiffness of someone realizing that the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. His earlier words replaying in his mind with a clarity that now felt heavier than before, each one landing differently in the presence of what he was witnessing. Captain Brooks remained off to the side, silent, observant, understanding now that whatever was unfolding did not belong to rank charts or procedure manuals, but to something older, something earned long before any of them had stood at this gate. Arthur finally moved, not stepping forward, not breaking the space, but simply inclining his head a fraction, acknowledging the man in front of him in the same quiet way he had acknowledged everything else, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying the same steady tone that had never once risen despite the tension that had surrounded him. "It has been a long time, Colonel," he said, and Hayes let out a slow breath, the kind that came from memory rather than the present, his eyes softening just slightly as if the years between then and now had collapsed into a single moment standing at the gate. "Too long, sir," Hayes replied, the word again deliberate, intentional, leaving no doubt for anyone listening that this was not formality, but something chosen, something meant. Behind them, one of the guards shifted his stance, unsure whether to remain at attention or step back, the boundaries of his role suddenly unclear, while another soldier further down the line straightened fully, his gaze fixed forward, instinctively mirroring the respect he now understood was required. Collins swallowed once, subtly, his hands tightening at his sides as he looked from Hayes to Arthur, then back again, searching for something that would explain what he had missed, but there was no explanation offered, no lecture, no correction spoken aloud, only the undeniable evidence in front of him that he had misjudged something far beyond his understanding. Hayes stepped forward slightly now, closing the distance just enough to shift the moment from recognition to action. "We were told you might never come back," he said quietly, and Arthur's expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes, something distant, as if the idea of returning had never been part of his plan, only the result of something that had called him here despite himself. "I was not planning to," Arthur answered. Just as steady, just as controlled, and Hayes nodded once, as if that answer made perfect sense, as if it required no further explanation. The silence returned, but it was no longer tense, no longer uncertain, it was settled, grounded, and in that silence Hayes turned slightly, his gaze shifting just enough to acknowledge the space behind him, the guards, the officers, the entire checkpoint that had witnessed the exchange, and though he did not raise his voice, did not issue a command in the traditional sense, the weight of what had already been said was enough to carry his next words across the line. "Open the gate," he said, and the order moved instantly, not because it was loud, but because it was final, and as the barrier began to lift with a slow mechanical hum, Private Collins stepped back without being told, his earlier certainty gone completely, replaced by a quiet understanding that respect was not something assigned by uniform or position, but something revealed, often too late for those who failed to recognize it at first glance. The barrier rose slowly with a mechanical hum that seemed louder than it should have been, drawing every eye toward its movement as if the simple act of lifting it carried more meaning than anyone present could fully articulate, and Arthur Hale did not step forward immediately, not because he hesitated, but because he did not rush, his pace governed by something internal rather than the urgency of the moment. Colonel Hayes remained where he stood, waiting, not out of obligation, but out of respect, his posture unchanged, his presence steady as the gate opened fully between them, and only then did Arthur take his first step, measured, unhurried, crossing the threshold not as someone being granted access, but as someone returning to a place that had never truly been closed to him. The sound of his boots against the pavement was soft, almost lost beneath the quiet, but it carried a rhythm that seemed to settle into the space around him, grounding it, shifting it, and as he passed by, Captain Brooks straightened instinctively, offering a subtle nod that Arthur acknowledged with the faintest tilt of his head, a silent exchange that required no words. Private Collins remained still, his eyes following Arthur as he moved, the weight of the moment pressing against him in a way that no formal reprimand ever could, and for the first time since he had taken his post, he felt uncertain not about the rules, but about the limits of what those rules could explain. As Arthur approached Hayes, the distance between them closing completely, the colonel stepped aside just enough to align himself beside him rather than in front, a small adjustment that spoke volumes to those who noticed it, and together they began to walk inward, not quickly, not ceremonially, just two men moving forward with a shared understanding that did not need to be displayed. The convoy remained paused, untouched, its drivers silent, their earlier impatience replaced by a quiet awareness that they had witnessed something rare, something that would not be written into any report but would stay with them long after the engines restarted. Collins exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders in a way that felt unfamiliar, and he glanced toward Brooks, searching for confirmation, for context, for anything that would help him process what had just happened, but Brooks did not offer explanation, only a steady look that suggested understanding would come with time, not instruction. Inside the gate, the air felt different, calmer, as if the boundary itself marked a shift not just in location, but in meaning, and Hayes spoke again, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the two of them. "We kept your file active," he said, not as a statement of policy, but as something closer to acknowledgement, and Arthur's expression remained composed, though there was a faint narrowing of his eyes, a flicker of something that passed as quickly as it came. "You should not have," Arthur replied, his tone even, without accusation, without regret, simply stating a truth that did not need to be debated, and Hayes nodded once. Accepting that answer without challenge, they continued forward, the base unfolding ahead of them in quiet order, flags shifting lightly in the breeze, distant personnel moving through their routines unaware of the significance that had just passed through the gate, and for a moment, neither man spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy, but settled, like a conversation that had already taken place long before this meeting. Behind them, the barrier lowered again, returning to its original position with the same mechanical precision, but nothing about the checkpoint felt the same, not to Collins, not to Brooks, not to anyone who had stood there and watched as a single name changed the weight of everything around it, and as the convoy engines finally came back to life, one by one, the sound carried forward into the base, following the path Arthur Hale had just taken, as if even the movement of machines now aligned itself quietly behind the presence of a man who had never once needed to announce who he was. They walked in silence for several yards, the steady rhythm of their steps echoing faintly along the wide concrete path that cut through the base, and while the environment around them remained orderly and familiar, there was a subtle shift in how people reacted as they passed, small changes that would have gone unnoticed to most, but not here, not now. A young lieutenant standing near a parked transport vehicle straightened instinctively, his posture sharpening without being told, his eyes following the two men as they moved past, sensing without understanding that something significant was unfolding just beneath the surface. Further ahead, a pair of enlisted personnel mid-conversation fell quiet as Colonel Hayes approached, their attention drawn not by his presence alone, but by the man walking beside him, a figure who carried no visible rank, no insignia, and yet seemed to command a different kind of space entirely. Hayes noticed it too, the way the base itself responded in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, and he allowed it to happen without interruption, without explanation, because he understood that recognition did not always come from orders, sometimes it came from instinct. They still talk about that day, Hayes said after a while, his voice low, measured, as if he were speaking more to memory than to the man beside him, and Arthur did not turn his head, did not slow his pace, but there was a slight shift in his gaze, something distant surfacing for just a moment before settling again. Stories tend to change over time, Arthur replied, calm, even, his tone carrying no pride, no dismissal, just a quiet acknowledgement of how memory works. Hayes let out a faint breath that might have been a restrained laugh, though it carried no humor, only understanding. Not that one, he said, and for a moment, the air between them felt heavier, not with tension, but with something unspoken, something that did not need to be detailed to be fully present. They approached a flagpole at the center of the courtyard, the flag moving gently in the breeze above them, its motion steady, constant, and Hayes slowed slightly, his eyes lifting for a fraction of a second before returning forward, as if marking the moment without making a show of it. Arthur's gaze followed briefly, not lingering, but acknowledging, and then they continued, behind them. The movement at the gate had resumed, but the tone had changed, quieter, more deliberate, as if those who remained there carried with them the echo of what they had witnessed. Private Collins stood at his post, but his focus was no longer on routine traffic, his attention drifting inward, replaying the exchange, the words, the silence, the way Colonel Hayes had removed his cap without hesitation. And the realization settled deeper with each passing second that respect, real respect, did not announce itself. It revealed itself in moments like that, when everything else fell away. Inside the base, a staff sergeant stepped aside as Hayes and Arthur approached, offering a sharp nod that Hayes acknowledged briefly, but Arthur did not react outwardly, his attention fixed ahead, his presence unchanged by the reactions around him, as if he had long ago stopped measuring himself against the responses of others. Command wants to see you, Hayes said after a few more steps, his tone returning slightly to formality, though it never fully reclaimed it. They made it clear the moment your name came through, and Arthur gave a small nod, not surprised, not curious, just accepting, as if whatever awaited him had already been decided long before he reached the gate. They turned toward a low building at the far end of the courtyard, its structure plain, functional, but the activity around it more controlled, more deliberate, and as they approached, the doors opened before they reached them, a quiet gesture that spoke to preparation rather than coincidence. Hayes slowed just enough to allow Arthur to step forward first, a subtle motion, almost unnoticeable, but one that carried the same meaning as everything else that had happened since the gate, and as Arthur crossed the threshold, the space inside seemed to shift in the same quiet way, not through sound, not through motion, but through the recognition of a presence that did not need to be announced to be understood. The interior of the building was quiet in a way that felt intentional, the kind of silence shaped by discipline rather than absence, where every movement carried purpose and every sound seemed measured against something unspoken. And as Arthur Hale stepped inside, the faint echo of his boots against the polished floor drew a few distant glances that quickly turned into stillness. Officers seated along the far wall straightened without being told, conversations cut short mid-sentence, and even those who did not recognize him immediately seemed to sense that the moment demanded attention. Colonel Hayes followed just a step behind, not leading, not directing, allowing Arthur to move forward at his own pace, and the subtle shift did not go unnoticed by those who understood how rarely such deference was given without reason. At the far end of the room, a large wooden door stood closed, guarded not by soldiers, but by presence alone. And as Arthur approached, it opened from within before he could reach for it, revealing a smaller chamber beyond, more contained, more focused, where 3 senior officers stood waiting, their posture already set, their attention fixed on the man entering. No introductions were made, no names exchanged, because none were needed, and for a brief moment, time seemed to narrow to the space between them, the air carrying the weight of years that had not been spoken about, only remembered. One of the officers, a general with silver at his temples and a bearing that spoke of decades in command, took a single step forward, his gaze steady, searching not for confirmation, but for connection, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, carrying the kind of restraint that only came from understanding exactly what he was addressing. "Arthur Hale," he said, not as a question, but as recognition. And Arthur inclined his head slightly, the same minimal acknowledgement he had given at the gate, unchanged in tone, unchanged in presence. The general held his gaze for a moment longer, then removed his cap in a motion that was neither ceremonial nor casual, but something in between, something personal, and the other officers followed without hesitation, not out of protocol, but out of alignment with what the moment required. Behind Arthur, Colonel Hayes stopped just inside the doorway, his posture firm, his expression controlled, but his eyes reflecting the same understanding shared by those in front of them. The room remained silent, but it was not empty silence, it was filled with recognition that did not need to be explained, and in that space, the absence of words carried more meaning than any formal briefing ever could. The general finally spoke again, quieter this time, as if the words were meant only for the man standing before him. "We have been waiting for you," and Arthur's gaze did not waver, but there was a faint shift, something almost imperceptible, like the surface of still water disturbed by a distant ripple, and when he answered, his voice remained calm, steady, untouched by the weight placed upon it. "I did not intend to be found," he said, and the general nodded once, slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had already understood. Outside the chamber, the bass continued its rhythm, vehicles moving, orders being carried out, but inside, time held its position, anchored to a single presence that required no introduction, no explanation, only recognition, and as the door closed softly behind them, sealing the room from the rest of the world, the weight of Arthur Hale's name settled fully into the space, not as a legend spoken aloud, but as a reality quietly acknowledged by those who knew exactly what it meant. The room remained still long after the door closed, as if even the walls understood that what stood within them did not belong to routine command or daily operations, and for a few seconds, no one spoke, not because they did not know what to say, but because anything unnecessary would diminish the weight of what was already understood. The general lowered his hand slowly, his cap resting at his side, his gaze never leaving Arthur Hale, and there was something in that gaze that did not come from rank, but from memory, from a time when authority had meant something different, when it had been earned moment by moment rather than assigned by position. Arthur stood as he always had, steady, composed, his presence unchanged by the attention around him, and yet the room itself seemed to align with him, as if everything within it had quietly adjusted to a standard that could not be written into any manual. "We reviewed the records," the general said finally, his voice low, controlled, carrying the careful tone of someone stepping into a space that required precision. "What little remains of them," and Arthur's expression did not shift, but there was a faint narrowing in his eyes, not defensive, not surprised, simply aware. "There was never meant to be much left," Arthur replied, and the simplicity of the answer settled into the room with quiet finality, closing the door on questions that might have been asked under different circumstances. One of the other officers shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition, as if the boundaries of what could be discussed had just been drawn without needing to be stated. The general nodded once, accepting that limit without challenge, then stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but repositioning himself within the moment. "You should know," he continued, "your name still carries weight here," and Arthur's gaze moved briefly across the room, not searching, not measuring, just acknowledging, and then returned forward. "Names do not carry weight," he said quietly, "actions do, and those belong to the past, and the words did not diminish the statement that had been made, they clarified it, grounding it in something that no title or recognition could alter. Outside the building, the bass continued to move, but the rhythm had changed subtly, words spreading in quiet, indirect ways, not through announcements or orders, but through the kind of communication that traveled faster than sound, carried by those who had seen, those who had heard, those who had understood without needing explanation. Back at the gate, Private Collins stood a little straighter than before, but it was no longer the posture of certainty, it was the posture of awareness, his earlier assumptions replaced by something more measured, more deliberate, and as another vehicle approached, he checked its credentials with the same procedure, but not with the same mindset, his eyes lingering just a fraction longer, as if looking beyond what was immediately visible. Inside the room, the general placed his cap back on, not as a signal of authority, but as a return to function, and he gave a small nod toward Hayes, who remained at the doorway, silent, present, and then he looked back at Arthur. "Whatever you need while you are here," he said, leaving the sentence open, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for a man who did not require offers to define his purpose. Arthur inclined his head once more, the same minimal gesture that had carried him through every moment since the gate, and turned slightly, his gaze settling toward the door, as if the reason for his presence lay not in the room, but beyond it. No one stopped him, no one questioned him, because the understanding had already been reached, not through explanation, but through recognition, and as he stepped toward the exit, the room remained silent once again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been acknowledged, and in that silence, one truth settled deeper than the rest, quiet and unshaken, that respect was never demanded, never announced, it was revealed, in moments like this, when a single name was enough to remind everyone what it truly meant.